Hey everyone, my name is Charlie and welcome to Fully Equipped. Yesterday we talked about having a pure heart and how Jesus began to foreshadow how the Gentiles would also receive the gospel. The disciples still don't fully understand who he is. Today's reading, chapter 8, is an important chapter in this book. We get to learn more about who the Christ is. We open on a similar story to the one in chapter 6, but today Jesus is feeding the 4,000. Again, we read that Jesus has compassion on the crowds who are hungry. He sees the needs of his people. This story is important for a couple of reasons. Mark has a purpose behind recording the same miracle happening on two different occasions. The first reason is that when Jesus fed the 5,000 in chapter 6, he was feeding Jewish people. Now, in chapter 8, he's in Gentile lands, but he also miraculously feeds them as well. The significance of this is that Jesus is the bread of life for all people, Jews and Gentiles. The other important reason is that the disciples still don't get it. Mark is emphasizing that even though Jesus gave them another chance to see who he was through this miracle, they still didn't get it. Even though Jesus was able to provide abundantly for his people, more than they needed, they still didn't see who he was. Actually, I think it's easy for us to have this same issue. We see God provide for us or heal us or comfort us, and then just a short time later we forget. When we need him again, we doubt whether he's able to do the impossible. But remember that Jesus is the suffering servant. He's acquainted with our need, our grief, our pain, our chronic problems that never seem to end. He understands and he has compassion. We can trust him. Mark continues with a story about the Pharisees who are trying to test him. They want a sign that clearly proves that Jesus is the promised Messiah. Miracles weren't good enough for them. They wanted more proof. But they're not doing this because they wanted to have faith in him. They just wanted to expose him as a fraud. Jesus is grieved by this because even though the Pharisees have all the knowledge through the scriptures and they've seen him perform miracles, they still won't soften their hearts. Nothing will ever be enough proof for them. Jesus promises that they won't receive a sign from him because if they open their hearts and see what he's already done, then that is more than enough proof. Again, Jesus is showing who he is to the people, but they aren't understanding. The next story shows how the disciples too still don't get it. Jesus warns them of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Leaven is what you put in bread to get it to rise. He's illustrating how when you put a bit of leaven in dough, the whole loaf is impacted. Similarly, when the Pharisees and Herod proclaim that Jesus is not the Messiah, then this teaching begins to impact everyone who hears. Unbelief begins to spread throughout the whole population. Jesus is wanting them to trust who he says he is, not who others say he is. The disciples are distracted and they're thinking about literal bread because they only have one loaf on the whole boat. They still don't get what Jesus is saying about who he is. These two stories about the Pharisees and the disciples highlight something important. Notice the way that Jesus responds to the Pharisees' lack of understanding compared to his response to the disciples. The Pharisees know the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah inside and out. They're supposed to be prepared for him. But when he comes, they're too hard-hearted to accept him. The disciples, on the other hand, are soft-hearted. They're open to him. They just don't perceive him yet. But soon, Jesus will reveal himself, and they will finally get it. Then we get to a story about a blind man who gets healed. Notice that Jesus heals the man in two stages. He puts spit on the man's eyes and then asks him if the man can see anything. He's received a partial healing, but it's still a bit blurry. So Jesus lays his hands on the man's eyes a second time and his sight is restored. Is this because Jesus' power wasn't good enough to just heal him on the first try? Actually, when we look at this story in the context of people not being able to see who Jesus is, perhaps the man's story is highlighting the gradual understanding that the disciples will have about Jesus. Now they see him, but he's a bit blurry. They know he's the Messiah, but they don't really get what that means. Soon they will see clearly. Jesus is also the suffering servant. This is what Jesus reveals in the next section. Jesus asks who other people say that he is. Some think he's John the Baptist raised from the dead, or Elijah, or some other prophet. Jesus asks who his disciples think he is, and Peter answers that Jesus is the Christ. Christ isn't Jesus' last name. It comes from the Greek translation of the Hebrew word, which means anointed one. Peter is saying that he believes Jesus is the one they have been waiting for, the one who has come to save them. And Peter is right. Jesus is the Christ. But he doesn't really understand what this means. Remember that the Jews were waiting for someone to come and destroy Rome, establish a kingdom, and bring them freedom from their enemies. Jesus begins to reveal that he's not here for that. He is here for something greater. He's come to bring freedom from sin, not just Rome. He's come to establish an everlasting kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, not just an earthly one. He hasn't come to be an inspiring political figure or a wealthy king. He's come to be the suffering servant. Jesus shows them that he will be rejected and killed, but after this he will be resurrected. This must happen because it is the way to bring atonement for sin and reconciliation between God and mankind. This is how the kingdom of God begins. Peter doesn't get it, and he's not happy that Jesus says that he will be killed. Jesus responds with a rebuke. "Get behind me, Satan." Jesus isn't calling Peter personally Satan. He's rebuking the schemes of the enemy working through Peter to try to get Jesus to stop fulfilling God's plan. Satan knows that his end is coming. So how does this equip us? The end of this chapter is super powerful. Jesus begins to speak to the whole crowd, not just his disciples. He announces to them the cost of discipleship. To follow him, people have to take up their cross. This isn't Jesus saying that all his followers need to be martyred or seek a painful life. He's actually saying that his followers have to deny themselves. What does this mean? It means that we are obedient to him. We trust him. We put the needs of others and the call of God above our own selfish desires. We don't make material possessions our God because this will not bring us salvation. Instead, we lose our lives in the sense that we recognize that our lives are not our own. Temporary loss for eternal gain. What is God calling you to do? What is holding you back? Let's be people who hang our reputations, our money, our time, our pride, our sin, our selfishness, and our fear of man on the cross and pursue the call of God above all else.